You won't believe this, but one morning I woke up to the sound of voices outside my window, voices that didn't belong. At first, I thought it was just some neighbors talking by the lake or maybe a group of tourists who had wandered too close. But then I heard laughter and footsteps on the gravel path that led straight to my cabin door. My stomach tightened. Who in the world would be walking around my property at this hour? I slipped on my boots and stepped outside, expecting maybe to find hikers who had gotten lost. Instead, I froze in complete disbelief. Standing right there on my front porch was a well-dressed realtor, clipboard in hand, leading a group of 4 people around my cabin like she owned the place. She was pointing to the porch beams, the roofline, the big lake-facing windows, and speaking in a loud, sleazy tone. "This gorgeous lakefront cabin just came onto the market," she announced proudly, "and trust me, folks, this one won't last long. The HOA is eager to find the right buyer quickly." My jaw practically hit the ground. I didn't know whether to laugh, shout, or just stand there in shock. Because let me be crystal clear, my cabin wasn't for sale. Not even close. This cabin was my retreat, my pride, the place I had worked hard for years to afford. It was where I came to get away from the noise of the city, where I had built memories with friends and family, where I'd poured sweat into fixing the deck, planting trees, and making it truly mine. And now here was some stranger telling people it was on the market. For a split second, I wondered if this was some kind of prank. Maybe a mix-up, maybe a realtor who had gotten the wrong address. But the moment I stepped forward and cleared my throat, all eyes turned to me. The buyers looked confused. The realtor, however, just gave me a quick glance up and down, then flashed a tight smile, like I was some inconvenience to her big sales pitch. "Oh, you must be the tenant," she said casually, waving her hand like I was just a bystander. "Don't worry, we'll be out of your way soon. We're just giving a quick tour before we finalize the listing details." My blood started boiling instantly. Tenant? Finalize what listing? I looked at the buyers and said firmly, "This cabin is not for sale. It belongs to me, and nobody, not this lady, not anyone, has the right to sell it." The buyers exchanged glances, suddenly realizing something wasn't right. One of them asked hesitantly, "Wait, so you own this place?" I pulled the keys from my pocket, unlocked the door in front of them, and said, "Yes. This is my cabin, paid in full, and nobody asked me if it was for sale because it isn't." The realtor's smile turned stiff. She cleared her throat, stepped forward, and whispered sharply to me, "You're making this harder than it needs to be. The HOA authorized me to show this property. They said it's part of the community's plan to refresh the neighborhood and attract better buyers. If you've got a problem, you'll need to take it up with them." Her tone wasn't apologetic. It was commanding, like she was telling me I had no say in my own property. That's when it hit me. This wasn't some mistake. This wasn't the wrong address. This was my HOA, the homeowners association I had already had a few run-ins with, pulling one of the boldest, most outrageous stunts I had ever seen. They had actually invited a realtor to trespass on my property and advertise my cabin as if it belonged to them. I could feel my face heating with anger. I told the buyers, "Folks, I'm sorry you were misled, but this cabin isn't available. Whoever told you otherwise lied." Most of them looked embarrassed, muttering apologies as they backed away. One man glared at the realtor, clearly irritated he had wasted his time. But the realtor wasn't backing down. She crossed her arms and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "You're going to regret interfering in this process. The HOA has every right to manage properties in this community, and if they've decided your cabin is to be listed, then you'd be smart to cooperate." That was the moment I realized exactly what I was dealing with. This wasn't just a pushy HOA trying to hand out fines for lawn grass or paint colors. This was an HOA that thought it had the power to erase me, to override my ownership, and to cash out on something I had worked for with my own blood, sweat, and savings. And if they were bold enough to bring strangers onto my land without permission, I knew this was only the beginning of their plan. I stood on that porch, staring down this smug realtor, and I made a silent vow to myself: if the HOA wanted a fight, they had just picked the wrong guy. I wasn't going to let them steal my cabin. Not today, not ever. Inside, my thoughts were racing a mile a minute. How long had they been planning this? Did they actually tell the whole neighborhood my cabin was up for grabs? Was this just the first showing, and were more realtors and buyers going to start showing up every weekend until I caved? The sheer audacity left me shaking with rage. I had seen HOA power grabs before, neighbors fined for having the wrong shade of paint on their shutters, families threatened over backyard sheds, but this? This was theft disguised as community management. And the scariest part? They thought they could get away with it. When the buyers finally left, muttering under their breath, I stood on my porch and glared at the realtor. "If you ever step foot on this land again, I'll report you for trespassing," I said, my voice steady but firm. "This cabin isn't yours, it isn't the HOA's, and it sure as hell isn't for sale." She sneered, muttered something about me being difficult, and stomped off down the path. But the damage was already done. The HOA had shown their hand. They wanted my cabin gone, and they thought they had the power to do it. Little did they know, I was about to show them just how wrong they were. Later that day, when the shock had worn off but the anger was still burning inside me, I decided I wasn't going to just sit around waiting for the next stunt. I needed answers, and I needed them face to face. So, I grabbed my paperwork, the deed, the tax receipts, everything that proved without a shadow of a doubt that this cabin was mine, and I headed straight down to the HOA office. The building itself looked like it was trying too hard to be important, with glass doors, polished floors, and a fake smile plastered on the receptionist's face. I didn't bother waiting. I told her flat out, "I need to speak to the president of this HOA. Now." She gave me a nervous little smile and said, "Oh, she's in a meeting." I leaned in closer and said, "Then you'd better interrupt it, because this meeting's about to get a lot more interesting." That must have been enough, because within 5 minutes, the door to the boardroom swung open and out walked the president herself. Now, I had dealt with her before. Let's just call her Karen, because she had that entitled smirk and sharp tone that could make anyone's blood pressure rise. She was the type who believed her position gave her power over everyone's lives, like she was some queen of the neighborhood. She gestured for me to come in, clearly annoyed, but acting like she was in control. I sat down across from her at the long boardroom table, spread out my documents, and said, "You want to explain to me why a realtor was trespassing on my property this morning, claiming my cabin is for sale?" Karen didn't even blink. She leaned back in her chair, folded her hands together, and gave me this slow, smug smile that made my skin crawl. Then, as casually as if she were announcing the weather, she slid a piece of paper across the table. "Because it is for sale," she said. I stared at the paper in disbelief. It was some typed-up board resolution with a bunch of signatures, stating that Lot 47, which was my cabin, was being listed in the best interest of the community. My first reaction was to laugh, like actually laugh out loud, because it was so absurd. I picked up the paper, waved it in her face, and said, "This is worthless. I own that cabin. I've got the deed, I've got the taxes, and you have zero authority to sell what isn't yours." Her smile didn't fade. In fact, it grew. "Oh, you can fight it if you want," she said smoothly, "but the board voted unanimously. We've decided your cabin doesn't fit the image of the neighborhood anymore. It's outdated, and frankly, we believe a more modern family home would raise property values. So, the cabin is being sold." My blood boiled. Outdated? My cabin was solid, well-maintained, and had stood on that land longer than most of the HOA members had even lived there. It wasn't some rundown shack, it was my home away from home. But here was Karen, talking like she had the authority to erase me with a snap of her fingers. I slammed my hand down on the table. You don't get to decide that. You don't own my land. You don't own my cabin. And if you think you can bully me out, you're dead wrong. Her eyes narrowed, and her tone shifted from smug to threatening. You can either cooperate and let this sale go smoothly, or we'll start making things very difficult for you. That sentence sent a chill down my spine, not because I was scared, but because I realized just how far they were willing to go. She wasn't even hiding it anymore. This wasn't about rules or community standards. This was blackmail. I leaned forward, staring her straight in the eye. Are you threatening me? I asked. She just shrugged. Consider it encouragement. Nobody wins if you drag this out. We'll fine you, we'll report you, we'll make living here unbearable. But if you step aside, let the sale happen, you walk away clean. My fists clenched under the table. I couldn't believe the audacity. They thought they had me cornered, like I was just some pushover who would fold at the first sign of pressure. Instead of arguing further, I gathered my papers, stood up, and said, "You just made the biggest mistake of your career, Karen. You picked the wrong person to mess with." She gave me a condescending smile and called out as I walked toward the door, "You'll change your mind. Everyone does once the HOA applies pressure." I didn't even turn around. My mind was already spinning with ideas, with plans, with ways to shut this whole scheme down before it could go any further. The drive back to my cabin felt like a blur, but my thoughts were crystal clear. This wasn't just about me anymore. If they could pull this stunt on my cabin, they could do it to anyone. They were running the neighborhood like it was their personal kingdom, and unless someone stood up to them, they'd keep taking whatever they wanted. But not this time. Not with me. That evening, I sat on my porch with my documents spread out, going over every line. Deed? In my name. Title? Clear. Taxes? Paid. HOA agreement? Nowhere did it say they had the right to seize or sell my property. They were bluffing, plain and simple. But they were dangerous bluffers, bold enough to bring a realtor and buyers onto my land without so much as a phone call. That meant if I wanted to protect my cabin, I couldn't just sit back and hope they'd stop. I had to show them I was serious, that they'd picked the wrong man to bully. And that's when the plan started forming in my head. If the HOA wanted to treat my cabin like it was on the market, then I was going to remind them, and the entire community, that this land was mine, and they had no power here. They wanted to threaten me with pressure? Fine. I was about to apply some pressure of my own. And I was going to do it in a way they'd never forget. The next morning, I woke up with fire in my chest and determination in my bones. If the HOA thought they could march people through my cabin like it was theirs to sell, then it was time to draw the line so boldly that even they couldn't ignore it. My first move was simple but powerful. I needed to shut down access. So, I drove into town and headed straight for the hardware store. I didn't waste time browsing. I went directly to the aisle with chains, padlocks, and heavy-duty steel. If Karen and her gang thought they could parade strangers up my driveway, they were going to find themselves locked out. I picked up the thickest chain they had, the kind you'd use to secure construction equipment, and a padlock that looked like it could withstand a bear attack. When I tossed them onto the counter, the cashier gave me a curious look and said, "Someone giving you trouble?" I just smiled grimly and said, "You could say that." Driving back, I felt like a soldier preparing for battle. Every bump of the road only reminded me of the realtor's smug face, of Karen's condescending threats, and of the HOA's arrogance. When I reached my cabin, I got out, walked straight to the front gate, and looped that heavy chain through the posts. With a satisfying clink, I snapped the padlock shut. That gate wasn't opening without me, not for a realtor, not for Karen, not for anyone. It felt like a wall had gone up between me and their nonsense. But I wasn't done. Because in my mind, a chain wasn't enough. I wanted everyone who even thought about setting foot on my land to know exactly where I stood. So, I drove back into town again, this time to the lumberyard. I bought a wide plank of wood, tall enough and strong enough to stand out, and when I got home, I painted it myself. Big, bold black letters across the front read, "Private property, not for sale, trespassers will be reported." The words practically screamed from the wood, and I wanted them to. I wanted them to burn into the mind of every HOA member who dared to look at my cabin like it was a bargaining chip. When I hammered that sign into the ground by the entrance, it was like planting a flag. This was my land, my cabin, and my fight. Anyone who wanted to test me would have to face that sign first. As I stood back, wiping sweat from my forehead, I felt a rush of pride. I wasn't just defending my cabin, I was defending the principle that no one, no matter how entitled, could take what I had built. Of course, it didn't take long for Karen to show up. That woman must have had spies around the neighborhood because within hours, her SUV came screeching down the road and stopped just outside my gate. She climbed out, heels clicking on the gravel, her face already twisted in anger. She pointed at the sign and shouted, "You can't put that here. It makes the community look bad." I leaned casually against the locked gate, arms crossed, and replied, "What makes the community look bad is you sending strangers onto land that doesn't belong to you." Her cheeks flushed red, and for once, she looked caught off guard. But she recovered quickly, stepping closer and wagging her finger like she was lecturing a child. "You don't understand," she hissed. "The board has already approved the listing. That sign is misleading, and the HOA will have it removed." I chuckled, calm and steady. "Karen, that sign isn't misleading. It's the truth. My property isn't for sale, and if you or anyone else touches this sign or this gate, I'll be filing charges for trespassing and vandalism. And unlike your so-called board resolutions, I've got legal paperwork to back me up." For a second, she actually faltered. Her mouth opened, then closed, like she didn't know what to say. But her pride wouldn't let her back down. "Fine," she snapped. "If you want to play it this way, we'll bring in the authorities. You'll regret this." I raised an eyebrow. "Good. Call them. I'd love for the police to come out here and take a look at my deed, my tax receipts, and my legal rights as the owner. I'd also love for them to ask why you're trying to sell property you don't own. Go ahead, Karen, make that call." She glared at me, her face tightening, her fists clenching at her sides. For the first time, I saw the cracks in her confidence. She was used to bullying neighbors into compliance, used to throwing her title around until people gave up. But me? I wasn't backing down. Not today. Not ever. The standoff lasted a good minute before she finally spun on her heel, storming back to her SUV. Gravel flew as she sped away, and I couldn't help but smile as I watched her taillights disappear. She thought calling the cops would scare me, but what she didn't know was that I was prepared, armed with every document I needed to prove her wrong. That night, I sat on my porch, sipping coffee and staring at the new sign by my gate. It glowed faintly under the porch light, a constant reminder that I had taken my power back. Sure, the HOA wasn't done, they never stop with just one attempt, but now the game had changed. They wanted to pressure me? Fine. I'd meet their pressure with my own. They wanted to test my resolve? They'd find out just how stubborn I could be. And deep down, I almost hoped they'd call the cops, because I was ready to expose their scam for the whole community to see. What I didn't realize then was just how soon that chance would come. It didn't take long. The very next day, just as the sun was peeking over the lake, I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. I looked out my window and saw Karen's SUV pull up again. This time she wasn't alone. 2 police cruisers rolled in behind her, lights flashing. She climbed out, smug as ever, waving her arms like she had just brought in reinforcements to finally put me in my place. I stepped outside calmly, papers in hand, and walked down to the locked gate. The officers approached while Karen barked at them, "There. That's the man. He's blocking a community-approved sale. He's violating HOA authority and causing trouble for everyone. You need to remove him and his sign immediately." She was almost shouting, her finger stabbing the air toward me like I was some criminal. The officers exchanged glances, clearly skeptical. One of them, a tall man with a stern face, held up his hand. "Ma'am, slow down. Let's hear his side before we make any decisions." Karen rolled her eyes dramatically. "His side doesn't matter. The HOA board already voted. This cabin doesn't belong to him anymore, it belongs to the community. He's trespassing on HOA property." That was it. I couldn't help but laugh. A real, belly-deep laugh that made Karen's face turn crimson. I held up my folder and said, "Officers, before you believe a single word she says, take a look at these." I slid the papers through the bars of the gate. The first officer took them and started reading. The second officer leaned over his shoulder. It didn't take long, maybe 30 seconds, before their expressions shifted. The tall officer looked up at me and said, "This is a deed, in your name." I nodded. "Correct. That's my deed. That's my title. And here are my property tax receipts, paid in full for the last 5 years. You'll also notice there's nothing in those documents giving the HOA the right to sell my cabin." Karen's voice screeched from behind them. "No, no, no. He's twisting it. The HOA has authority over all properties in this neighborhood. It's in the bylaws." She pulled a crumpled folder from her purse and shoved papers at the officers. "See? Right there. The board has the right to approve sales for the good of the community." The second officer took her papers and flipped through them. His eyebrows lifted. "Ma'am, this doesn't give you ownership. It says you can regulate paint colors, landscaping, noise restrictions. Nowhere does it say you can seize or sell private property. This has nothing to do with who owns the cabin." Karen's face fell. "But, no, you don't understand. We voted. We agreed. The cabin is outdated, it lowers property values. The board has the right," the officer cut her off firmly. "The board does not have the right to sell someone else's private property. Period. If you or anyone else continues to enter this man's land without his permission, you could be charged with trespassing." The silence that followed was delicious. Karen stood there, her jaw working, but no words coming out. Her smug confidence had finally cracked. The officers handed my documents back through the gate. The taller one nodded at me with respect. "Sir, you're well within your rights. This is your land, your cabin. Nobody can force you to sell it." Then he turned back to Karen, his tone sharp. "If you keep harassing him, you'll be the one facing charges. Are we clear?" I will never forget the look on Karen's face in that moment. It was like someone had popped her balloon of power with a single pin. She stammered, turned red, then tried to regain composure by muttering something about miscommunication. But the officers weren't buying it. One of them even told her point blank, "Ma'am, this is not a miscommunication. This is attempted property fraud. If this continues, we'll be opening a case." The so-called buyers, who had shown up again with the realtor, were standing off to the side. They looked horrified. One of them, a middle-aged man in a suit, stepped forward and said, "Wait, so this property isn't for sale?" I shook my head. "Nope. Never was. I don't know what lies the HOA fed you, but this cabin isn't going anywhere." The man looked furious, not at me, but at Karen. He turned to her and snapped, "You wasted my time, my money, and embarrassed us in front of law enforcement. You'll be hearing from my attorney." Then he stormed off, dragging the realtor with him. Karen's empire crumbled right there on my driveway. She tried to argue, tried to shout, but the officers finally told her she needed to leave immediately. With no one left on her side, she climbed back into her SUV, slammed the door, and sped away in humiliation. For the first time in weeks, I felt the weight lift from my shoulders. I had stood my ground, and the law had backed me up. But the story didn't end there. Word spread fast through the neighborhood. Neighbors who had once been too scared to speak up started knocking on my door, sharing their own horror stories about Karen and the HOA. Fines for things that weren't in the bylaws, threats of foreclosure for late fees that didn't exist, bullying tactics to push out longtime residents. My showdown with Karen had given them courage. People started attending meetings, questioning her leadership, demanding accountability. Within a month, the board held a special vote, and Karen was removed from her throne. When the dust settled, the community looked a little different. The HOA still existed, but its claws had been trimmed. No more fake fines, no more property scams, no more Karen ruling like a dictator. As for me, I still live in my cabin by the lake, with my bold sign proudly standing at the gate. Every time I see it, I'm reminded of that day I locked the chain, drew the line, and told the HOA loud and clear. This land is mine, and no amount of lies, threats, or scams will ever take it from me. And you know what? That taste of victory was sweeter than any lake breeze.